I was actually going to reference One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I was also going to talk about those lobotomies they used to do. They used to do these crazy lobotomy procedures when they really had no idea what they were doing, thinking that they were solving significant illnesses, and really they were just destroying people's minds. And so that's really important to understand, that Scientology's contempt for mental health services was rooted in a time where, sort of post-Freudian but pre-CBT, where there was a lot of really dangerous, scary stuff going on. And frankly, he wasn't guessing about a treatment, any more than Freud was. You know what I'm saying? Like, back in the day, there wasn't, and of course Skinner and behaviorists and others started trying to bring a science to mental health, but that was probably going on right at the same times that he was doing what he was doing. And so really everybody was guessing. So we can condemn his work as pseudoscience, which it was, but at the same time, that's pretty much all of mental health at the time. So it's interesting to get that perspective.
Absolutely. And I want to be clear about that, because I've been and since coming out of all of this, I have definitely looked into psychiatry and psychology extensively, and there are still issues all over the place with that stuff. So it's not like, it's not understandable why Dianetics would have had appeal back then, or why it still has appeal to people. I get it. The alternatives are not necessarily.
People are just desperate to feel good.
Right.
And they're desperate to feel worthy. They're desperate to get out of their anxiety and depression. They want to feel a sense of meaning and purpose. And so I just think that makes people vulnerable to anything. Essential oils beyond their natural powers, foot zoning, hypnotism, religion, whatever it is. People just want to feel good. And if they can find someone that either can help them feel good or at least make them think that they are getting better, people are desperate for any of that. And I think that's a crucial component to the formation and growth of a religious tradition.
I could not agree with you more.
Yeah,
absolutely. That is true. And that was the base that this whole thing started on, was people who were looking for that. And as I mentioned, it was a bestseller coast to coast, and people were very, very excited about it and the potential of it. The problem became that they couldn't get the results that Hubbard was promising from the book. Hubbard was living in New Jersey still. He was still married to Sarah. This is May 1950 now that the book was published. And literally, and this is legit, people started calling him and knocking on his door. And like, dude, what else you got? We got this, and this is great. What else you got? And almost immediately in June 1950, Hubbard started giving lectures in his home. He was renting a place, and people were showing up, and there were cars out front all the time, and they started doing these classes. And he's just kind of making this stuff up as he goes. He's not a scientist, this guy. He's not. He's a fiction writer, and he finds himself in this position now where people are treating him as legit. And he plays the part because this is what he's all about. He loves all this attention, right? And the money that came with it, because he wasn't giving these lectures for free. So people show up, he starts charging them, they start putting little courses together, and he's doing lectures like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then he's doing Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday lectures, and he's trying to work all this stuff out, and it's logistics and all this kind of stuff, and people start coming on board, and they create Dianetics foundations, actual little organizations in Los Angeles, in New Jersey, and different other places around the country. These Dianetics groups start forming up, just all on their own, because people are so excited about this. Kind of the same way, I guess, the meetup groups start now, right? People are just excited about it. Right. Hubbard is people are reaching out to him directly, and he starts traveling the country, going around to these groups and giving lectures. And he especially focused on California, and he went out to Los Angeles, Oakland, California, actually. And that was the site of the biggest lecture that I think he ever gave. It had, they filled up was it the Shrine Auditorium maybe? Or it was either in Oakland, they filled up a place, or it was down at the Shrine Auditorium. I think it was the Shrine. And he presented this woman as one of the first clears. Her name was Sonia Bianca, this poor woman. She goes up on stage, and you're supposed to have, oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. One of the things you're supposed to get with Dianetics is eidetic recall. Full recall of all things that have happened to you in the past. So, of course, everybody's all excited about this because here's the first clear they're going to lay their eyes on. And she comes up on stage, and Hubbard's standing there, and she's standing there, and somebody says, oh yeah, and she turns around, they do this little memory test where, they start asking her questions, and she couldn't even remember what color tie Hubbard was wearing. And she had just seen it. Right. So people are like, wait a second. Right. And immediately the crowd got ugly and things turned pretty bad pretty fast. Right. And this was sort of the beginning of people like, wait a second, what's going on here? You're not producing the goods. You say it can do all this stuff, but we're not able to do this. And here's this person you're presenting as a clear, and she can't do it. Of course, Hubbard, being the consummate con man, he came up with wonderful excuses for that and continued to travel around. And not everybody heard about that either, because this is 1950. This is now.
Pre-internet, right?
Yeah, there's no internet, right?
Now, did he use the term clear in his Dianetics book?
Yes, that was the goal. The original goal of Dianetics is the state of clear.
Got it. Okay,
yeah.
Got it.
So there's no internet. There's no fact checking. I mean, you can't fact check Hubbard's naval record or any of that. And at this point, and this is really, really important, at this point, Hubbard had sort of messed with his own biography and had this whole invented backstory for Dianetics that time that he had spent at Bethesda Naval Hospital before he'd hooked up with Jack Parsons was a time where he had developed Dianetics and where he had cured himself of lameness and blindness brought about by war wounds from combat.
Right.
All of the above is total nonsense, right? He had no combat wounds. He did go to the hospital because he did suffer from some damage from some their own shells going off below deck. And that caused an explosion, and that put him in the hospital. But he wasn't blinded in the hospital. He wasn't, lame in the hospital. He wasn't hobbling around on crutches. That wasn't what actually happened, but that's what he represented as happened, so that he could sell this story that's when he had developed the technology, the methodology of Dianetics. And he had tested it out, he said, on other veterans who were there in the hospital, and he had cured some of them. And in fact, he even claimed in a later lecture that there was a doctor there who had been doing some hormone therapy treatment, and Hubbard, messing with the patients and doing his proto-Dianetics on them, had skewed all the results of the study because people were getting better all of a sudden out of the blue, and the guys who were doing the hormone study didn't understand what was happening, right? He had this whole mythology connected with all of this that was later. You can fact check all this stuff now, and none of that stuff happened, but that's what he claimed. So
again, the parallel to Joseph Smith is this tendency of stories to grow more fanciful, for them to be edited, to be changed, and the claims to get bigger and bolder as time progresses.
Correct, exactly, right? Hubbard was no different than any other con man that way. So we come back to 1950. Hubbard's making these claims. He's telling these stories in his lectures about how he had developed Dianetics. In his lectures, notably, at least the ones that we have that have survived this whole time period, because we can't say I can't say I've seen every single lecture he ever gave. We just have the ones that have survived all this time, and the church has really done a pretty championship job of preserving stuff from 1950 that was originally recorded on wax discs and falling magnetic tape that now is falling apart. So we have this record of all these lectures that he gave and these books that he wrote. And so he's making these claims, and he never once credited Campbell or Winter or any of these guys. And they eventually turned on him. Over the course of 1950, Dianetics rose in popularity. These foundations grew to, impressive sizes, hundreds of members. And Hubbard was traveling around, and he would go to the foundations, and he would be the celebrity on site, and everybody was, oh my God, it's Hubbard and all this. And he would advise on what to do and how to run the organizations and stick his nose into what their business affairs were, because he owned the copyrights of Dianetics. I mean, it was his. So they're only operating on his blessing. And he would raid the bank accounts. He'd just go in and I need some money, and he'd take it, and he would say, do this, do that, do the other thing. And his organizational sense was so poor that they would just be like, what? Well, now stop. What are you doing? And then they'd try to rein him in, and they couldn't. And it was kind of this battle. And it ended up that people would quit, that, Campbell resigned from the board. Winter resigned, actually wrote a book about Dianetics and his involvement with it. And how Hubbard how he thought the procedure was good, but he thought Hubbard had gone off the rails. So he was making enemies almost right away. Within the first year, he had people who just hated his guts. And Dianetics
of course, that totally parallels Joseph Smith's early years, where early co-founders of the religion split, said that he had gone off the rails, and there were early implosions and defections from kind of the early incantations of his religious movements. So
there you go. Yeah. Same. Yeah. It's all just a playbook, you can just kind of lay it all out. So
but I'm going to keep drawing parallels, because I think it's useful for our listeners.
Absolutely.
To make note of parallels.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay. So end of 1950, Hubbard he goes into a pretty heavy depressive episode, actually. And he ends up in Palm Springs, and he writes a book called the Book 2 of Dianetics, Science of Survival. And this is another pretty thick tome. It's the next biggest book that he wrote the whole time of Dianetics and Scientology. The Dianetics and Science of Survival are the big ones. The rest of the books he wrote tend to be much smaller. And Science of Survival took the idea of a reactive mind and went one step further by introducing the idea of a life force, or a kind of, it doesn't use the word spiritual, but like a spiritual force. In other words, a non-physical manifestation of energy that is life, that is who we are. And he calls this Theta. And this is, again, foundational, which is why I'm bringing it up. Science of Survival is about emotion, and he made a big chart where he sort of plotted emotions on a scale, and he assigned numerical values to them, with like happiness and joy and that kind of thing at the top, and death at the bottom. He actually said death was the end of life is at 0.0. And you have the emotion of apathy, let's say at 0.01. When a guy's just totally lifeless and I just wish I was dead. That's apathy. And then you have grief and fear and anger, and it moves up to boredom, and then you have mild interest, and then happiness, and this sort of the scale. Right. And of course, there's all kinds of judgment factors there. If you think about it for a second, that this emotion is lower than this emotion, and, this kind of thing. There's all kinds of, judgment being laid down in this chart. And this chart is big. It goes column and column and column and column. And what he was saying is that this chart predicted human behavior. You would look up what emotion the person was at, and then you could go across the columns, and there would be sexual behavior. There'd be a column on sexual behavior. So what kind of sexual behavior could you expect from somebody who was at this emotional level, or what Hubbard called a tone level, a tone. That's what he called emotions, or tones. And this was a tone scale. He analogized it to music, a musical scale, right? With the harmonics and this kind of stuff. It was all very pseudoscientific, because again, all of this was literally created right out of his head while he was experiencing this depressive episode. And we know this because his personal secretary was there, and she later dished on the whole thing. So he writes this whole chart. He writes this whole book around it. He ends up, while he's doing this, he came up with the chart first. Then he flew to Cuba, went on a total bender, had kidnapped his daughter. He and Sarah had estranged at this point. So he kidnapped his daughter, Alexa, and just took her. And you can actually find newspaper reports about this, because Sarah was out of her mind trying to get her kid back. And Hubbard had her in hiding with DeMille. I can't remember his first name, but Cecil B. DeMille?
Yeah, the director of the book 10 Commandments movie, right?
Yes. It was his son or his nephew or something was hooked up with Hubbard and was like his personal assistant or something. And he was helping hide the daughter. And it was this very scandalous thing. And so eventually Sarah got the kid back, only with promises that she would never badmouth Hubbard, never say anything about him, recant all of her statements that he would beat on her, and had kidnapped their daughter. And I mean, it was a very, very, it turned out that Hubbard was an extremely abusive partner. His first wife also agreed with this assessment. She was also an abused, battered wife. So them, getting Hubbard out of their life was a really good positive thing for both of them. And Hubbard at this point, or shortly thereafter, met and ended up marrying his third and final wife, Mary Sue Hubbard. But that comes a little bit later. So beginning of 1951, we find Hubbard in Cuba, writing this manuscript or dictating it. It gets turned into a book. By August 1951, Science of Survival is published. From that, he comes up with a smaller version called Self-Analysis, which is sort of do-it-yourself auditing, where you can just kind of read the book and it's sort of the author kind of does the procedure on you. You recall things. It's really a memory stimulation kind of procedure. That's self-analysis. That also comes out at this time. Hubbard comes out of his depressive episode, stops drinking so much and gets back on the lecture circuit and ends up in Wichita, Kansas. Dianetics had gone completely bankrupt, and because of Hubbard's mismanagement and personal nonsense, and it was bailed out by a millionaire who lived in Wichita. And
Don Purcell, it says.
That's correct, Don Purcell. Right? He actually offered Hubbard haven and said, come here, set up shop. I love Dianetics. Purcell was very interested in self-improvement, and he thought Dianetics was the route to make that happen. And Hubbard's, national popularity by this point had waned. And there had been articles in Time and Life and other magazines from actual scientists panning science, Dianetics as a science. They said, there's no way this is a science. This is pseudoscientific hokum, and none of this stuff really makes a lot of sense. And please don't listen to it, right? So that was already hitting the shelves by the end of 1950.
And also, it looks like some of his former wives were talking about him in the paper. There were headlines saying he was insane.
Correct.
And even one of the original founders, I'm not sure if you've already mentioned this or not, one of those two founders you talked about said that he had never actually seen a clear person ever, right? So we've got early founders denouncing core claims that the religion was kind of based on.
Exactly. Well, it wasn't a religion yet.
What's that?
It wasn't a religion yet.
Right. Well, depends on how you define religion, but the institution or the organization, right?
Right.
And
yes.
But also just this idea of full financial collapse. You have this with Joseph Smith in the Kirtland time period where his founders are renouncing him, his co-founders. There's big, huge financial scandal. Everybody's defecting. And it's really, really fascinating that one of the traits of these religious founders is that they can lead something to greatness, have an absolute total collapse, be facing destitution and total failure, but somehow rise like a phoenix from the ashes.
Correct. That's right. And that's exactly what happened with Hubbard in Wichita. Yeah. Purcell bankrolled him, right? And he started the Wichita Foundation. And with Science of Survival as this newly minted book and self-analysis, Hubbard starts lecturing again about this new thing called Theta. And this is where it starts taking on really non-scientific overtones, because now he's talking about something that's non-material, that's immaterial, but that exists, and it's a life force. And the idea was with this tone scale was that by going up the tone scale, by more and more auditing, by doing more and more of the procedures, and Hubbard started developing new and expanded and different procedures to build on the original Dianetics procedures. And the procedures went through hundreds of changes over the years. So I'm not even going to get into all the specifics of that, because Hubbard tried lots and lots and lots of different approaches. But the basic idea was that we were now going to address the individual as a life entity rather than the reactive mind just as a part of his mind. And that by going up this, by doing lots of auditing, your tone level or your emotional state would improve, and you would be more habitually in a better frame of mind, a better state of mind. Whereas you're maybe chronically angry, you do enough auditing, and you go up to being chronically bored. Well, that's an improvement according to Hubbard's scale. And then you keep auditing, and eventually you get interested in things. And so now you're kind of chronically at mild interest. And that's a good thing according to Hubbard's scale. So empirically, this stuff really doesn't do this, but these were all Hubbard's claims, okay? So I'm laying all of this out and describing all of these beliefs and techniques, but I really probably should make clear, and I probably should have said at the get-go, I don't believe in any of this stuff. I'm just telling you what is there. You know, this is what I was steeped in for decades. So I'm very, very, very intimately familiar with all this stuff. I've read all these books, listened to all these lectures. I spent decades learning this stuff. So, okay, so Wichita, Hubbard's getting a new start. It gets going, but Hubbard's personality, you know, he hasn't really changed at all. And he really didn't learn a whole lot from the collapse of Dianetics in the first place. So he starts taking Purcell for a ride. Purcell ain't interested. He's got all these debts he's bringing to the fore, right? Purcell had to pay them all off. And then there's more stuff. And Hubbard's just not really being like what he thought he was going to be like. And here's the thing, though, is Purcell bought all this stuff out, basically bought Hubbard's debts. So guess who owns Dianetics? Right?
Whoa,
Purcell
so he owns
does.
the copyright?
Yeah, because Hubbard didn't own it anymore because he had squandered it, right? And in order to get out of the big debt situation he had been in.
Can I just have to, you're getting annoyed at this, but Joseph Smith tried to sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon to pay off debts. So, I mean, these parallels are crazy.
I know. This is actually really interesting because in all the time I've talked to Jonathan, and we've done some great, great, great talks, we haven't really done a tit for tat comparison like this. And this is really interesting to me. Yeah. So please don't think I'm annoyed. I'm actually fascinated.
Good. Well, this is fun.
Yeah. So
and this is super amazing that you've got all this history in your memory. So this is great.
Yeah, this is my life for a long time, man. I tell you, yeah. This is the one thing I get to say I'm an expert on. So,
yay.
Yeah. So, okay. So it collapses, of course, as it always does. And by 1952, Hubbard has sort of squandered his goodwill with Purcell and ends up going out to Phoenix, Arizona. And that actually is by 1953, I think, is when they ended up out in Phoenix. But through 1952, the thing to talk about during this time period is really the research. And Hubbard was researching. I use that term very loosely, but it is the word Hubbard used, and I'll kind of use it. His research did not consist of going and consulting with other scientists or religious folks or anybody. It was all him. And it consisted of, this is an interesting twist. In a lecture that Hubbard gave in 1950, he, and we don't have the lecture for some strange reason. The church has never released this actual lecture. We just have word of it. Hubbard described the idea of being able to build a machine that would be able to assist in the auditing procedure by detecting emotional or mental charge. He said that he started making connections to the idea that the reactive mind and the mental image pictures that people form when they go through life actually have electrical charge connected to them, which could be measured by a machine if you built a machine to these particular specifications. Well, it ended up being a machine that's called a Wheatstone bridge, or what we now know as 1/3 of a lie detector, right? It's the skin resistance meter. So if you're measuring skin response, or it's called galvanic skin response, or GSR, you're measuring resistance to an electrical flow of that goes through goes across the skin of your body. Your skin is electrically conductive. So a chiropractor named Volney Matheson built this machine based on what Hubbard had suggested in his own ideas. At least this is the lore, right? I still have to dig in and see if this is the case. But Hubbard definitely gave that lecture, and Volney definitely built the device and presented it to Hubbard, and it was called an electropsychometer, or what they now call an e-meter. This is still in use by Scientology. It's been fancied up and prettied up, but the circuit board is the exact same design as what they did back in 1951. Hubbard gets this machine, and it's got dials and needles and all these goofy things on it, and you hook somebody up to it by having them hold a couple of soup cans that have alligator clips that lead into this machine, and it creates an electric circuit that goes across your body. It doesn't go into your body. It's not that strong. You don't feel any electrical conductivity when it's going through. It's a very, 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 very tiny amount of current. And again, this is just measuring GSR, right? This isn't measuring your mind or your brain or, your mental image pictures. It's measuring skin resistance. But Hubbard had this whole mystique and lore that he built up around this device, that what it's actually doing is it's measuring mental image pictures that create resistance to the electrical current. And it's the mental image pictures that you are relieving, and the electrical charge that is connected with these pictures dissipates. And that's why the needle will respond when you ask a charged question like, tell me about the time you were 5 and you got bit by the dog. Boing, the needle hits, right? Oh my God, there's something, right? Look at that needle move. There's electrical charge connected with me saying dog, right? So this is the proof that this device is registering mental image pictures that have electrical charge connected to them. That's it. That's the proof. The needle moved. So, based on this proof, right, Scientologists, Dianeticists bought into the idea that this electropsychometer was something that would assist them in their auditing process. And you use it to ask questions and see what kind of response you get on the needle. And if the needle moves in response to your question, there must be electrical charge there, and there must be something to audit. And so we will audit that thing that we just asked you about. And in the course of doing that auditing, of course, you desensitize it, and so the needle stops moving. Well, that's just proof that you've erased that charge from your mind, see? That's the interpretation by Hubbard of how this whole thing works. Okay, so Hubbard got this e-meter and he went to town. He had himself audited. He audited his new wife, Mary Sue. They audited other people, and they started going to town on what they could find with this e-meter based on what was reading on the dials. And what they started doing is they started finding, this actually first started coming up in 50, but with the e-meter, they really went to town on this. They started finding engrams, incidents of pain and unconsciousness in past lives. Because the procedure of Dianetics calls for going earlier if the current incident is not destimulating, is not resolving, you go earlier. Is there an earlier similar time you got bit by a dog, let's say? Well, if you're sitting there in a session and you're holding these cans, and the auditor is asking you, looking at the dials, and the dials are moving, right? The needle's moving. And you're sitting there and you go, well, I just told you about the time I got bit by the dog and I was 5 years old. There definitely is not an earlier time than I got bit by a dog. And they go, well, there's something here. So we'll take a look and see if there's an earlier time. And the guy goes, well, okay, well, there's this picture of my getting bit by a dog, and I'm wearing a Confederate uniform. People just started coming up with answers in past lives. And so this concept of having lived before, and this is where the Theta concept comes from, and this is where the life force thing, and this is where past lives enter into Dianetics. It's still not a religion. They're still calling it a science. They're still using the Dianetics moniker, but they're now into past lives and this Theta thing. And it was called the Theta, some people called it the Theta theory back then, right? You won't find that in the written literature, but that's what they were calling it. So So Hubbard went to town on this, and they started delving into and purposefully looking for past life incidents that would contain lots and lots of charge, or would really make those dials just slam, right? Those needles slam around on the dial. And Hubbard, if you go back and listen to or read the transcripts of Hubbard doing auditing, and there are lots of those available, you can see that Hubbard was a professional at asking leading questions. He would direct people exactly where he wanted them to go, and yet it claimed at the same time that he was not doing that, but he very clearly was. I mean, it was really blatant. I mean, it's so black and white. It's amazing he actually got away with it, but he did. And so he would lead people with leading questions to common incidents that he believed existed millions and hundreds of millions of years ago.
And can again, this is just interesting. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Joseph Smith is noted for is taking any contemporary movement or philosophy or idea or theory or doctrine and somehow incorporating it into his theology, as if it's sort of revelation from God. And it just sounds like, just in a totally different time period with a totally different set of almost bricks, he's got some experience with the occult. He's got some experience with psychology. He's got some experience with hypnotism. He's learned about science a little bit. And this is just his 20th century amalgamation of memes and ideas and thoughts and movements that he becomes exposed to, that then he incorporates. That's one thing that that really does strike a bell again. The second one is, and this is, this is to me really fascinating. He's moving away from science and gaining popularity. In other words, science has to stick to provable, results and claims. And he's realizing that, it's not quite as, it doesn't sound quite as fantastic or as promising if I have to be bound by the data and the peer review of science. So instead of like, oh my gosh, you're questioning Dianetics, let's start a research lab and really show that the data demonstrate meaningful change, he's going the opposite direction and saying, we'll make the claims more fantastic, more out there, more spectacular, and the last thing we're going to do is be constrained by science or data, because that's not cool, that's not sexy, that's not exciting, that's not as compelling. And what makes religion compelling is when it's making promises far beyond its actual capacity. Promises to heal, promises of salvation, promises of purity, promises of an afterlife. All these are huge, big promises that it can never deliver on, but that make people willing to give everything to a really big promise. That's the second thing I'm hearing. The third thing I'm hearing is actually a little bit disturbing to me, as is the others, but as I've been studying satanic ritual abuse, claims of satanic ritual abuse, and the whole kind of hysteria in the early 1980s and early 90s about recovered memory, I've been learning about the perniciousness of sort of an attempt to combine some of these practices of hypnotherapy with a therapist or a guide who wants to inject their own narratives into people's mental health efforts. And as soon as you've got that, the ability to suggest with hypnosis, with people who aren't well, who are vulnerable, who are seeking help, you can really do harm, but also have an incredible amount of control over people and create memories that don't exist, but that become very powerful and even dominating in people's lives. And I'm hearing traces of that, which I never really tied recovered memory and hypnosis to Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard, but I'm starting to make that connection now, and you tell me if I'm totally off there.
No, you are spot on. That's exactly what's going on.
That's so disturbing.
Oh, yeah. No, this is 100% what's going on.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, this is why I highlighted that Hubbard was an accomplished hypnotist. I mean, he knew his way around on this stuff. He was no amateur. And what he was doing was absolutely, very, very self-serving, and it had nothing to do with science. And I don't really know, and factually, I don't really even care whether he thought he was doing science or not. He wasn't. And I don't think he really thought that he was, because he panned science every chance he got. He was constantly down on psychology, hated psychiatry, was really down on the government, actually had quite a few anti-government statements to make. He hated paying taxes, for example, so he was always down on that. And he was down on organized religion. So he was presenting himself and his subject as the one true, only real path to some kind of, first it was competence and ability and mental ability, and then eventually it became spiritual enlightenment and eventually immortality. So yes, the claims did get more and more exaggerated over the years, as we'll go over. So it was, everything you just said was spot on.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating and disturbing.
Exactly. So, and the e-meter was a device that lended credibility to this, because it's not me saying it, it's the meter. Look, the dial, the needle moved, man. What am I supposed to say? Of course, it's Hubbard who's telling you what the interpretation of the needle dials are, right? But but people kind of miss that when somebody's offering them an explanation for something that they don't understand. Yeah. They look at it and go, well, I don't get it. Well, this is what it's doing. Oh, okay. I mean, it's amazing how easy it is to do that with people, actually, but that's kind of how we are. So a lot of people bought into this. Now, Hubbard had lost a lot of followers from the original Dianetics wave, but he retained some of them. And with this Theta thing and the new book in Wichita, he was gathering a new core of followers, see? And then he ends up having to badmouth Purcell because, of course, Purcell turned on him. So, of course, Purcell was never with him and was always out for himself and was only trying to steal Dianetics from me. This was Hubbard's claims later on after he screws Purcell over, right? So this is his modus operandi. So in developing the subject, he takes this e-meter, he goes to town, and he takes this idea of Theta, and he goes to town, and he ends up, through the course of 1952, really developing this idea. And this was the transitional phase between the science of Dianetics and the religion of Scientology, which would eventually result from this. In fact, it was at the end of 1951 that he first used the term Scientology in any sense, in a written sense. And it was in early 1952 that he gave his first lecture where he introduced the word Scientology. But it didn't become a religion, and that whole thing didn't develop for another year or two. So 1952 is sort of the year of the Thetan. Hubbard takes this idea of Theta as this life force, sort of nebulous sort of energy thing, and he turns it into a Thetan with he makes it a noun. And so you're a Thetan, you're not a body. I'm a Thetan. This body is not what I actually am. My life force and the thing that continues to live even after the body dies is the Thetan. And the Thetan is the thing that we're now going to investigate to find out what it can and can't do, what its potentials are, all this kind of stuff. And this is where the term operating Thetan is developed, 1952. And this is again foundational concepts for Scientology, which is why I'm going into detail about it. An operating Thetan is a Thetan that is free of having to be encumbered by operating a body in the material universe. He starts coming up with this concept of the material universe, matter, energy, space, and time, or MEST. He coins this word, MEST, the MEST universe, right? Matter, energy, space, and time. The Thetan is separate from the MEST universe. It's not contained within it. The MEST universe and a body that you operate is more like a thimble in the thumb of your Thetan. You're this immaterial entity that exists independent of space and time. So that's what he develops through 1952. And okay, so then we move into 1953. He continues on this bent, and by the end of 1953, he's building up this new core of followers who are all about this new stuff. And they might have heard about Dianetics, or they read Dianetics and they came in through that route, but then they learn about the E-meter and this Theta stuff, and if this is appealing to them, and to a certain number of people it was, they thought Hubbard was the bee's knees, and he was onto something really amazing, and they were now developing all these new procedures that were not just recalling or reliving past incidents, but there were other things to do now, other exercises and auditing procedures, and Hubbard just went to town with this. So he was still making claims this entire time. He's stringing people along this whole time with the promises of healing and mental clarity and spiritual release. Now that's an added bonus here. And he hasn't gotten into the religion territory yet, but what ended up happening through all this time that he's making these claims, the FDA starts looking into this and goes, hey, dude, you don't get to say stuff like that. You know, you don't get to say you get to cure, that you have the answer to curing cancer or leukemia. Like, what are you talking about? You know, huh? And so he's actually some Scientologists or Dianeticists are being charged with practicing medicine without a license. This is bad, right? This is not reflecting well. Hubbard doesn't want legal trouble like that. So end of 1953 comes along. Hubbard has relocated, I believe at this point, to Phoenix, Arizona. He skipped town, skipped Wichita, left Purcell in the dust. Doesn't own the copyright to Dianetics anymore, so he can't keep calling his stuff Dianetics. So he's introduced this new term, Scientology, which I'm absolutely sure he brought in on purpose early on so he could do exactly this. He switches everything over, and he incorporates the Church of Scientology as an actual tax-exempt organization. They apply for tax exemption. They get it in 1956, I think, is when it officially goes into play. Maybe 55, maybe 54, but definitely by 56, they are a fully recognized tax-exempt organization, and they are a church. And in 1954, Hubbard really starts going to town in Phoenix. He creates the Golden Dawn series of lectures. And if anybody's familiar with Aleister Crowley or that whole thing, then Golden Dawn is a term that comes out of that. And Hubbard starts drawing from his occult past. And he starts creating this idea of levels and moving up these levels. And you're going to go from this state of, you know, the encumbered, what he called aberrated. You know, you can't see in straight lines. You see crooked. You misperceive things because of your reactive mind, because of your spiritual barriers and trauma. You're an encumbered human being, and you're not well off, you're bad off. And there's this state you can attain, and it's called operating Thetan, or OT. And clear is kind of in between these two states. So you go from crappy person to a clear to an OT. And that's sort of the initial levels of Scientology. That's the basic structure of what you're trying to attain. And Hubbard is over-promising and under-delivering basically for the next 9 years, right? But there's more. I'll get into some more of the details here. So he reestablishes himself in Phoenix, Arizona, and he starts the Church of Scientology. And that's the first place where the organization really got going. And he's developing new procedures. And he gets in bad, of course, with the people in Phoenix eventually. And he skips town, like he always does. And he ends up in Washington, D.C. And there is where they start what is called the founding church, even though they really officially started in Phoenix. He relocates to Washington, D.C. He's got aspirations of getting involved in government. Not himself, but like creating safe ties with the government so that they'll have legal protection. And he's already become a religion and incorporated, and he has tax exemption. So now his claims about healing fall under claims of faith and not science. So he can kind of get away with making these claims and not having the FDA come after him. In the same way that, you know, spiritual televangelists can heal you, and the FDA doesn't show up and say, hey, Bub, stop practicing medicine without a license, right? They get a pass on that stuff. Well, so does Hubbard at this point. So he can continue over-promising and under-delivering, and as long as the rubes keep coming in and giving him the money, and he's setting up this very structured sort of path to enlightenment now. It's very loosey-goosey still. I should say the structure really comes in the 60s, but the genesis of it is all through the 1950s. And he is now traveling around. He does twice yearly congresses. He does what's called advanced clinical courses, and he's building up city by city, area by area. He starts new organizations. All the old Dianetics foundations had all shut down by this point, or had converted into churches of Scientology. And he was encouraging especially during 54, 55, that the ministers wear ministerial robes, and this is where the Christian symbology comes in, where they come up with the cross. They have an 8-pointed cross in Scientology, and the idea of ceremonies. He writes a marriage ceremony. He writes a funeral ceremony. He comes up with all this stuff. He writes a creed for the church because you have to have that to apply for tax exemption. And it's all very religious sounding. And he bases it all on sort of Christian based ideas. But he's also bringing Crowley symbology and thinking into this. And the Golden Dawn, for example, is one example of that. And there are others. With the symbology, like the cross that he adopts, the 8-pointed cross is a rosy cross. It's a Rosicrucian cross, which was used in the OTO, which was Crowley's thing. So there's these ties to it, but unless you're familiar with the occult, you wouldn't recognize that, right? And these people who were following Hubbard didn't have a clue about the occult. That's not who these people were. So they didn't know that Hubbard was just drawing left, right, and center from all these different subjects and sort of making this new medley called the Church of Scientology. But he was really going to town on the religion angle at this point. And this is where we should probably mention that in the past, Hubbard was quoted by 3 sources that we know of. I think at least 3, definitely at least 3, that if you really want to make money, you start a religion.
Right. Yeah, that's
right?
the famous quote. And because it number one, it legally protects you from any scrutiny that any other business or corporation or mental health, whatever, would be under. It saves you from any of that scrutiny and legal oversight. And then it allows you to go into the realm of sort of the unfalsifiable claims that are so fantastic that it captures people's imagination to the point where they're willing to give their lives to it because the claims are so fantastic.
Exactly. And that's the organization that Hubbard starts building. And I have to note here, just this is my own conjecture, but I believe based on everything that I've learned and read over the years and talking to so many people who actually, even some people who were around during this time, I've gone as far back as that in a couple cases. Mary Sue, his third and final wife, was crucial to this whole thing. Because remember, I said that Hubbard couldn't organize his way out of a wet paper bag. He was very, very bad at organizational skill and ability. And his ability to control his finances was very, very poor as well, until he met Mary Sue. And after that point, after he marries her and he gets her pregnant and they immediately are having kids, I think they ended up having 4 or 5. There's an abrupt change where Hubbard suddenly now is not tearing apart the organizations he's building as fast as he's building them. And I think that was Mary Sue's influence. And that's my conjecture, and I freely say that. But regardless, once he was hooked up with her, the organization started becoming more stable. And this started in Phoenix, then DC, and then eventually they moved at the end of the 1950s to England. They actually left the country entirely, and he set up shop in East-Grinstead in Sussex, England, and at a property called St. Hill Manor. So all through the 1950s, he's sort of forming up these organizations. There's churches now in Seattle, Hawaii, Los Angeles, and I think there were, London. I think he opened up England also in 1952, and he went over there and gave some lectures. And he was just constantly traveling around lecturing to people, and he was writing books. He was, again, the guy was prolific. He was a writer, and he could write. What he was writing wasn't so great, but the fact that he could sit down and pound out a book in a very short period of time was a skill that the guy had, and he started pounding out books. You have Fundamentals of Thought. You have New Slant on Life. You have Problems of Work. You have a bunch of books that come out during this time period. And they're sort of foundational books and ways that he thought he could take the principles that he had been developing and maybe apply them to work situations or to life situations where it would draw people in and get them more interested in the subject of Scientology and get them in and paying for auditing and for classes. Because at this point, and really starting back in 1950, they were not only selling the ideas and the books that Hubbard was writing, but they were selling classes in how to become trained as an auditor so that you could audit other people the same way Hubbard did. And they were selling e-meters. They were producing them and selling them. And Volney Matheson was making money. Hubbard was making money. The organizations that were forming were paying Hubbard, I think, 10% of their income, like every other week or something. So he was now riding a cash train, and he was making money, and real money. And he was making a family, and he was actually building a life that was, for the first time in his whole life, was actually kind of a stable sort of life. Even though he was traveling all over the place, he was having kids and all the rest. Okay, and he and Mary Sue are running this whole organization. And if you want to see what that dynamic actually looked like in real life, the best thing I could recommend to you is to watch a movie called The Master by Paul Thomas Anderson.
Yeah, with who's the actor who's passed away?
Philip Seymour Hoffman.
It's a brilliant, and I was always not sure. I knew that was at least loosely based on the life of L. Ron Hubbard, but it wasn't. He wasn't playing L. Ron Hubbard, so I wasn't sure how explicit that was.
It was exactly L. Ron Hubbard.
He wasn't called L. Ron Hubbard in the movie, right?
No, he wasn't. He was Lancaster Dodd was the name of the character.
But he's like typing on a typewriter on a boat, and you're like, this is obviously him, right?
Oh, absolutely, it was him. The sequences are different enough that you cannot really say, you wouldn't be able to take Paul Thomas Anderson to court and sue him for, appropriating L. Ron Hubbard and his life story, because they made enough changes that it's not him. But that's why I said that if you want to see the dynamic between Hubbard and his wife, who's played by Amy Adams in the movie, and how she dealt with things and how Hubbard dealt with things and how they treated their followers and how Hubbard would come out and do lectures, they nailed it. I mean, nailed it. Paul Thomas Anderson is the one guy who has never been connected with Scientology who has truly understood what I think Hubbard was actually like and what Mary Sue was kind of like too. She was not like L. Ron Hubbard. She was different. She was her own person. But I do believe that she was at times, I think she really did serve as the backbone of the organization, because Hubbard had his ups and downs, and he was a pretty disturbed person. So he had his moods. But there's no evidence that he, for example, ever got away with beating on her. We know for sure that he beat his first two wives, and he totally neglected those kids that he had with his first two wives. But there was no evidence that he did some kind of turnaround of that once he hooked up with Mary Sue. And I think that's more Mary Sue's strength and ability to deal with him and his nonsense and his personality than other people had in the past. So she was her own strong character, because Hubbard was a dominating person, and he was also charismatic. It's really interesting and difficult to explain to people, because when you see him, especially later in life where most people focus, but if you go back, and you look at this time period, Hubbard was not a bad-looking person, and he wasn't grossly out of shape, and he had a way about him. And he had that flaming red hair, and he had that gregarious personality, and when he turned it on, He was the life of the party. He absolutely was. That's also reflected in the movie. So you see both sides of him turning on and turning off in different situations. And that's the brilliance of The Master, is it really got Hubbard. So that's why I recommend that. So through that time period, then, you have these tumultuous fits and starts. But basically, Scientology was an expanding, growing movement through the 1950s. Hubbard relocates to England in 1959, sets up shop at St. Hill Manor. They had been getting money from training classes and from professional auditing. Hubbard set up what he called Hubbard Guidance Centers, or HGCs, in each of the churches of Scientology around the world. They train people on Hubbard's lectures and written materials, of which there are books and books and books and books and books of them. And they professionally audit people. So if you don't want to train to become an auditor, you just want to get the auditing yourself, you can do that. But it's going to cost you thousands of dollars to do it, right? Actually, hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point. Originally, it wasn't quite that steep, but now, that's where it's at. So it was always kind of expensive. And that was the product that his churches, or what he called his organizations, he hardly ever referred to them as churches. And most Scientologists don't call them churches. They call them organizations, right? They love their terminology in Scientology. There's tons of it. So all these orgs or organizations were forming up. And as the years went on, more and more and more of them opened. There's, Kansas City and St. Louis and Minneapolis and San Francisco, Portland, right? You have Salt Lake City. These churches just started springing up. Individual Scientologists would go out and start these things, and they would get permission from Hubbard to use the trademarks, because he was trademarking all of his terminology, all of his books. He was the sole owner, and he was collecting royalties all this time. They're still collecting royalties. And these churches would form up, and he wanted more and more churches, because that was more and more income for him and more popularity. So for whatever reason, he relocates to England, I believe because at this point, America had become a little hot for him. He traveled all over the place, and he was kind of good at burning bridges at the same time as he was building up this organization. And England became a focal point. And through the 1960s, from 1960 to 1966, Hubbard stayed in England at St. Hill Manor, and he had Scientologists come to him. And he delivered this big class called the St. Hill Special Briefing Course. And this was like an intensive, master level course that only the best of the best would go do. So we had hundreds of, a couple hundred people there at a time. And they would stay at this little village, East-Grinstead. They didn't know what hit them, because it was really just this little township. I mean, it was really hardly anything on the map. I think it's about 45 minutes or an hour outside of London. And they had to get used to this sudden Scientology presence, and there wasn't really a whole lot they could do about it, because Hubbard was a property owner there, and people were showing up and they were spending their money and that sort of thing. And so it sort of developed into this sort of, thing. And Hubbard built up St. Hill Manor. They renovated it, the property, et cetera. They built buildings and stuff. But through the 1965, 66, Hubbard is basically lecturing twice a week, developing new procedures. And he has said that basically at this point, they had solved getting everybody up to the state of clear. And that was something that they could now promise with some degree of certainty, is that you could get to this state of clear, but it had been redefined. So it was no longer all the promises from the original book, Dianetics. There was no more claims of eidetic memory. There were no more claims of you're not going to get sick anymore, or we're going to cure your leukemia. That was kind of there if you wanted to believe it, but it wasn't like that was the first thing they were telling you. And they had kind of toned it down a bit, and he was making more spiritual state claims, like you're going to become this, operating Thetan thing, and that kind of became the new goal. And so Hubbard spent years, working people over and getting money from them and having them come to St. Hill and train under Ron directly. And he would lecture, and you can see pictures of the stuff. And there'd be, probably about 50, 60 folks at a time there. And there was kind of this constant enrollment, sort of ongoing enrollment in the class. It wasn't like blocks. I think maybe originally he might have envisioned it that way, but it ended up becoming kind of an open enrollment, continuous class sort of thing. So what they were teaching in 1965 was pretty different from what they were teaching in 1960, but it was all still called the St. Hill Special Briefing Course. And
I have to draw one quick parallel.
Yeah.
It sounds like he goes to a place, builds it up, burns bridges, has to leave, and kind of goes on. And Joseph Smith starts in New York. Then he goes to Kirtland, Ohio. Then he goes to Independence, Missouri. Then he goes to the frontier of, I think, Missouri. Then he ends up in Illinois, which is where he's eventually killed. But there's leaving these trails behind of kind of burnt bridges and scorched earth where he has to move on. That's almost the trademark of a charlatan, right? Like the music man, right. He moves on from town to town because you can't hurt too many people in one town before people kind of catch on to you, right?
Exactly. And the difference with St. Hill was that Hubbard was kind of the rich guy, the rich American who was kind of throwing his money and his weight around, and he had influence at this point. Not necessarily political influence. Politicians didn't like him, but he had money. And he was this brash American, and East-Grinstead's this tiny little village. And he just, at first he tried being very PR, very nice. He was the marshal of their parade, and he tried working with the community and stuff. But Hubbard's temperament was not the kind of temperament that he was into hearing other people's ideas about things. And eventually that's the thing that would end up biting him in the butt. So, but St. Hill, this period of time from late 59 until 1966 was the longest time period where he was stably in one place. He did travel from time to time to the United States or to other places like Australia to do lectures and stuff, but mainly that's where he was located, and that's where he raised his family. He had his kids by then, and that's where they were staying. And he built up. That's where he developed what is now known as the formalized bridge to total freedom. The terminology isn't too over the top, right? So the bridge to total freedom is a symbolic idea that actually comes from the end of Dianetics. In the first book, Hubbard said, look, and it's interesting. At the end of the first book, he says, look, this is the work. I've put this out here. Let's run with it. Maybe other people will develop ideas. Maybe we'll build a bridge to a higher place. If we use that symbolically, maybe we could use this Dianetics to bridge the chasm of darkness and go to a higher place of existence, right? And at that point, of course, he was still talking about clear, but he held on to that analogy. And in 1964, 65, he comes out with this bridge to total freedom. And it really is a series of graduated levels that you climb in doing Dianetics and Scientology to get to the state of clear and then rise up these OT levels. And he's broken it down into different levels. And at first there were only 3 levels.